In the autumn of 1962, 12 American Green Berets stepped off a transport aircraft at RAF Changi in Singapore, then climbed aboard a Bedford truck for the 2-hour drive north to Kota Tinggi. They were hand-picked operators from the 5th Special Forces Group, men who had already survived advisory missions in the Mekong Delta, where the water ran brown and the tree lines hid things that killed you. They had been sent to attend a 6-week course at the British Far East Land Forces Jungle Warfare School. Most of them believed it was a diplomatic posting, a handshake in uniform, before they returned to the real war. Then they met their instructors. The British soldiers waiting for them did not look like elite warriors. They were lean to the point of wiry, most of them barely over 11 stone. They wore faded greens that had been patched, restitched, and patched again. Their boots were Soviet-soled canvas and rubber affairs that one American staff sergeant described in a letter home as something you'd wear to mow a lawn on a Sunday. Their rifles were SLRs, self-loading rifles, the L1A1 that Commonwealth forces had carried since 1954. Heavy, long, semi-automatic only. By American standards, already a generation behind. The first training exercise was a simple patrol, 4 kilometers through primary forest south of Kota Tinggi. The Americans expected to cover the distance in under 2 hours. Their British instructor, a sergeant from 22 SAS who had spent 3 years in the Malayan interior, told them to plan for 8 hours, for 4 kilometers. The Green Berets laughed, not quietly, not behind closed doors. They laughed in the briefing room. The sergeant let them. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply said, "Right then, try it your way first." They tried it their way. They moved at their standard patrol pace, approximately 100 meters per hour, through thick vegetation. Good noise discipline by American standards. Rotating point man. Security halts every 15 minutes. They were confident, professional, and certain they were proving a point. 3 hours in, the British sergeant appeared beside the American point man. No one had heard him approach. No one had seen him move. He had been paralleling their patrol at a distance of less than 20 meters for over an hour, and not a single American had detected him. He tapped the point man on the shoulder, and the American nearly shot him. "You've been dead since the first hour," the sergeant said. "I've had eyes on your patrol since the ridgeline. You sound like a lorry driving through a greenhouse." He was not exaggerating, the sergeant explained, with no condescension but no sophietness either, what they had done wrong. Their standard issue boots had hard-cleated soles that caught on every root and vine, producing a scraping noise audible at 550 meters in still air. Their metal canteen cups rang faintly with every step. Their nylon webbing rasped against bark each time they squeezed between trees. Their M14 rifles, at nearly 44 inches overall length, snagged branches with every lateral movement. Individually, each sound was trivial. Together they produced an acoustic trail that any competent tracker could follow blindfolded. "In Malaya," the sergeant told them, "we worked out that a 4-man SAS patrol, moving at our standard rate, barely registers above ambient noise, like a man breathing at 5 meters. Your patrol, with all that metal and those hard soles, is producing 3 or 4 times that level. In a quiet canopy where the background sits around 30 decibels, that difference is the difference between invisible and dead." The Americans had no answer for that. None of them had ever thought about sound in those terms. They had trained in noise discipline, certainly, hand signals, no talking, careful movement, but no one had ever measured the baseline acoustic output of their equipment, their footwear, their weapons, their very method of walking, and told them it was killing their own men. That was the moment the laughter stopped. Over the following 6 weeks, those 12 Green Berets would have every assumption they held about moving through dense terrain systematically dismantled by soldiers who had spent 14 years perfecting the art of becoming invisible. The story of how British soldiers learned to vanish begins not in a training school, but in a war. One that started in 1948 among the rubber plantations and tin mines of Malaya, where the British Army discovered it had no idea how to fight an enemy it could not see. The Malayan emergency lasted from 1948 to 1960. It was Britain's counterinsurgency crucible, though British veterans get annoyed when you call it Britain's Vietnam. They point out, with some justification, that Britain won. The enemy was the Malayan race's Liberation Army, communist guerrillas who operated from deep camps in primary forest, so thick that aerial reconnaissance could not penetrate the canopy. They would emerge to attack rubber plantations, tin mines, and police stations, then disappear back into terrain where the undergrowth closed behind them like a door. The MRLA knew the interior intimately. Many of their fighters had served as anti-Japanese guerrillas during the occupation, trained by the British themselves under Force 136. They understood how Europeans moved, what mistakes they made, and how to exploit every one of them. Conventional infantry patrols blundered following them and found nothing. The guerrillas heard the British coming from 400 meters away and simply relocated. By the time a patrol reached a suspected camp, the fires were cold, the shelters stripped, and the occupants were 5 kilometers deeper into terrain no conventional force could follow them through. By 1950, the army had tried every tactic in the manual. Battalion strength sweeps through suspected areas, cordon and search operations, aerial bombardment of camp locations identified by surrendered prisoners. The results were dismal. It could take dozens of operations to produce a single confirmed guerrilla casualty. Company following company, thrashing through vegetation, exhausted and demoralized, for returns that barely registered. Then a man named Mike Calvert arrived, and everything began to change. Brigadier Mad Mike Calvert had commanded 77th Brigade within the Chindits during the Burma campaign, experts at leading long-range penetration raids behind Japanese lines. He was aggressive, unconventional, and deeply unimpressed by the Army's approach to Malaya. In 1950, he was given command of a new unit called the Malayan Scouts, which by 1952 would be redesignated as 22 Special Air Service Regiment. Calvert's insight was deceptively simple. The Army was treating the forest as an obstacle to push through. Calvert understood it was an environment to inhabit. The guerrillas were not winning because they were braver or better armed. They were winning because they belonged to the terrain in a way that British soldiers did not. His early patrols were rough. The men were tough, but their fieldcraft feat was crude. The transformation began when Calvert recruited trackers from the Iban people of Sarawak, headhunters, in the literal sense, who had worked alongside British forces since the Second World War. The Iban moved through primary forest the way a pike moves through a river, silent, patient, reading the water. They did not crash through vegetation. They flowed around it, testing each footfall with the outer edge of the heel, before committing weight, stepping between fallen branches rather than on them. Everything they carried was lashed tight, wrapped in cloth, silenced against contact, and they moved with agonizing slowness. Because in dense terrain, speed was not measured in distance covered, but in noise created. The SAS learned from them. It took years. The lessons were paid for in blood. But by the mid-1950s, SAS four-man patrols were spending weeks in the deep interior, locating guerrilla camps that battalion sweeps had missed entirely. They would establish observation posts within 30 meters of enemy positions and sit there motionless for days. By the late 1950s, the efficiency of SAS operations had improved beyond recognition. Not through heavier weapons, not through more men, through silence. One operation in particular showed what the new doctrine could achieve. In 1958, the SAS were tasked with tracking down Ah Hoi, a senior MRLA commander known as the baby killer, for his attacks on civilian settlements. Ahoy had evaded capture for years, operating from camps deep in the Teluk Anson swamp in Perak, a vast expanse of marshland where waist-deep water, mangrove roots, and suffocating humidity made conventional military operations nearly impossible. Previous company-strength sweeps had turned up only empty shelters and cold fire pits. The guerrillas simply moved deeper into the swamp when they heard the soldiers coming. The SAS approached the problem differently. Small patrols moved into the swamp for weeks at a time, living in conditions that would have broken most soldiers. They waded through stinking water. They slept in hammocks strung between mangrove trunks. Leeches attached to every exposed surface of skin. Mosquitoes carried malaria, and through it all, the patrols maintained absolute silence, moving at their standard rate through terrain that punished every step, mapping guerrilla routes and identifying supply lines that the MRLA thought were invisible. The cumulative pressure of SAS patrols systematically closing the net, combined with psychological operations using helicopters, fitted with loudspeakers broadcasting surrender appeals over the swamp at night, broke the MRLA's will. Ahoy's group became the last significant guerrilla force to surrender during the emergency. No single dramatic assault ended the campaign. It was patience sustained over months that achieved what firepower could not. No battalion sweep could have done it. No aerial bombardment. The swamp required men willing to live inside it silently for longer than the enemy believed possible. That was the doctrine. And when the emergency ended in 1960, the SAS took it to Borneo and made it sharper still. The Borneo confrontation of 1963 to 1966 is one of the most successful military campaigns in British history, and almost nobody has heard of it. Indonesia's President Sukarno attempted to destabilize the newly formed Federation of Malaysia by sending regular troops and irregular fighters across the border from Kalimantan into British-protected Sarawak, Sabah, and Brunei. The SAS were deployed along 1,000 miles of border, mountainous terrain smothered in canopy, so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 15 meters. Their mission was to establish observation posts, track Indonesian incursions, and conduct cross-border raids, so secret that the British government denied they existed until documents were declassified in the 1990s. These were the Claret operations, and they required the regiment to spend weeks at a time deep inside Indonesian territory, invisible and self-sufficient. It was in Borneo that SAS Fieldcraft reached its sharpest form. The weight discipline was religious. Every item a man carried had to be justified in writing before a patrol departed. Rations were repacked from tins into lightweight cloth bags. Water went into sofite bladders, not metal bottles. Ammunition was limited to what was strictly necessary, typically 120 rounds per man for a 3-week deployment, a number that horrified American military planners accustomed to issuing 400 rounds for a 3-day operation. The logic was simple and pitiless. If you needed 400 rounds, your mission was already over. You had been found. The SAS did not plan for firefights. They planned to never be detected at all. The walking technique alone took weeks to master. The heel was placed first, outer edge making gentle contact, weight transferred slowly, feeling for anything that might snap beneath the sole. If the ground felt unstable, the foot was withdrawn and placed elsewhere. Each step took 2 to 3 seconds. In thick undergrowth, it could take 5. On the 16th of February 1965, the doctrine was tested in the most violent way possible. An 8-man patrol under Sergeant Eddie Geordie Lilico was ordered to cross the border from Malaysia into Indonesian Borneo to recce a section of the Sakayan River, where intelligence had identified Indonesian troops using the waterway to transport supplies. The patrol crossed at a point known as Melancholy Mountain, cached their rucksacks at a lying-up point, and Lilico took a four-man team forward to scout an abandoned camp they had found the previous day. Trooper Alan Jock Thompson, a Scotsman from the Fife coalfields, was on point. As he moved around a clump of bamboo, an Indonesian patrol opened up with automatic fire at close range. A round struck Thompson in the left thigh, severing his femoral artery. Lilico shifted right to engage, but stepped directly into the sights of the Indonesian lead scout. Before he could fire, the Indonesian shot him through the left hip. 2 men down in a 4-man patrol, deep inside enemy territory, with no immediate support. What happened next is what makes this action one of the most studied in SAS history. Thompson, despite a severed artery and a shattered leg, snatched up his rifle and killed the Indonesian soldier who had just shot Lilico. Both wounded men continued firing, dropping at least 2 more enemy soldiers and forcing the Indonesians to pull back. When the 2 uninjured troopers broke contact and moved to the emergency rendezvous, following standard operating procedure, Lilico and Thompson were alone. Both were bleeding badly. Both were deep inside Indonesian territory, and both did exactly what their training had prepared them for. Lilico, unable to stand, realized that if he activated his SAR-BE rescue beacon, the signal would draw the Indonesians to his position and compromise the rest of the patrol. So he switched it off. He chose to bleed rather than endanger his men. Then he began dragging himself toward the border, inches at a time, moving only when surrounding noise covered the sound of his body against the ground. He paused for 30 minutes or more whenever he heard movement nearby. Thompson, meanwhile, applied a field dressing to his own leg, pumped himself with morphine to manage the pain, and lay motionless. Indonesian soldiers searched the area around him. They passed within meters of his position. He could hear their boots, their voices, the click of their equipment. He did not move. He did not call out. He lay still, hour following hour, for the better part of 2 days, bleeding and doped on enough morphine to kill a lesser man, while the enemy searched the undergrowth around him. Lilico was eventually found by Gurkha soldiers who had been sent to search for the patrol. He had been bleeding in the undergrowth for 36 hours. Thompson was recovered shortly following, barely conscious but alive. Both men survived. Both returned to active service. Lilico's decision to switch off his rescue beacon, choosing potential death over compromising his patrol, earned him the military medal. Thompson received a mention in dispatches. Lilico went on to serve 33 years in the regiment before his death in 2016. But the lesson the regiment drew from the action was not about the firefight. It was about what happened following. Thompson survived because he could lie motionless for 2 days with a severed artery while the enemy searched for him. That is not natural. That is trained, and it was trained through thousands of hours of practice in the specific art of doing absolutely nothing silently for longer than seems humanly bearable. By the time the confrontation ended, the SAS had compiled a body of operational knowledge that no other Western military possessed. It was this knowledge, proven across 12 years of continuous operations in Malaya and already being sharpened further in Borneo, that they brought to the training school at Kota Tinggi. And, as we have established, the Americans laughed. The laughter cost lives. By 1967, American special forces in Vietnam were drowning in the same problem the British had solved 15 years earlier. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV SOG, was running the most dangerous missions of the war. Small teams of 6 men were being inserted deep behind enemy lines for reconnaissance and direct action. They were superbly trained, ferociously brave, and equipped with the most advanced technology available. They also had casualty rates that, in some units, exceeded 100% annually, with the entire roster turning over in 12 months from deaths and wounds. The problem was acoustic signature. Not the obvious kind, gunfire and shouting, But the constant low-level noise that 6 men carrying nearly 200 kilograms of collective equipment generates simply by existing in dense vegetation. Metal clips touching metal buckles, nylon webbing scraping bark, hard-soled boots catching on roots, the audible hiss of a PRC-25 radio in squelch in otherwise silent air, a rifle barrel over a meter long on the standard M16 dragging against bamboo with every step through thick growth. Each sound was individually tiny. Together, they created a signature that Viet Cong trackers, who had spent years learning to read the soundscape of their own terrain, could identify from hundreds of meters away. SOG teams were being detected, tracked, and ambushed with a consistency that defied every countermeasure the Americans tried. They deployed experimental acoustic sensors. They tried infrared detection. They reduced team sizes from 6 to 4. They brought in Native American advisors to teach counter-tracking techniques. Nothing worked. The detection rates barely shifted. By early 1968, senior commanders were quietly discussing whether reconnaissance operations should be suspended entirely in certain border areas, because the cost in lives had become unsustainable. The Australians had already cracked this. The Australian SAS regiment, which had learned its field craft directly from the British during exchange programs and joint Borneo operations, had adapted British doctrine for Vietnam's specific conditions. Their results stunned American intelligence analysts. According to operational reports from 1968, Australian SAS patrols were completing reconnaissance missions at roughly double the American success rate. The proportion of contacts initiated by the enemy, the critical measure of who was detecting whom, was dramatically lower for Australian patrols than for American ones. The Australians were not merely surviving. They were operating in a different category entirely. The secret was everything the Americans had dismissed at Kota Tinggi 6 years earlier. Slower movement, 25 to 40 meters per hour instead of 100. Lighter loads, 25 kilograms instead of 40. Obsessive sound reduction, canvas pouches instead of metal, taped buckles, Sophie-soled boots, no dog tags, and above all, patience that seemed to border on paralysis until you understood what it actually produced. When General Creighton Abrams, commander of MAC-V, requested cross-training between American and Commonwealth SAS units in 1968, the program that resulted was, by several accounts, deeply uncomfortable for the Americans involved. Not because it was physically harder. Green Berets were already among the fittest soldiers in any military. It was uncomfortable because it required them to abandon instincts that had been reinforced since their first day in uniform. The first exercise was a demonstration. An Australian SAS instructor laid a standard American M16 on a table beside a modified L1A1 with a cut-down barrel. The M16 measured 39 inches. The L1A1, following modification, measured 33.6 inches. The Americans in the room shrugged. 6 inches was nothing. Then the instructor explained. In thick growth, a patrol makes contact with surrounding vegetation on average 200 times per 100 meters of movement. A shorter weapon reduces those contact points by 40 to 50%, because the shorter barrel allows the soldier to angle the rifle vertically more overten, threading it through gaps rather than pushing through them. Each avoided contact is one less sound. Over 1,000 meters of patrol movement, that is, hundreds of sounds that never happen. Hundreds of moments where the enemy does not hear you. A Green Beret captain objected. You're losing muzzle velocity. You're losing accuracy past 200 meters. The instructor did not argue. He asked a question instead. How many of your firefights in this country have taken place beyond 550 meters? Silence. They all knew the answer. Almost none. The dense growth that defined the operational environment limited sight lines to 30, perhaps 50 meters. The Americans had been optimizing their weapons for open field engagements that never happened, while generating noise signatures that got them killed before any engagement could begin. American infantry doctrine was built on firepower and speed. Make contact, win through superior volume of fire, need to move with purpose and aggression. The SAS doctrine inverted both principles. Firepower meant you had failed. Speed meant you would be heard. Every trained reflex the Americans trusted was, in this operating environment, the thing getting their reconnaissance teams killed. The cultural resistance was fierce. American military identity prized aggressive action. The idea that slower was better, that carrying less ammunition was an advantage, that the correct response to proximity with the enemy was to sit motionless rather than engage. These concepts scraped against decades of institutional thinking. One American officer described the SAS method, not entirely unfairly, as professional hiding. The phrase was meant as an insult. The Australians and British instructors took it as a compliment, but the numbers were unarguable. American teams that adopted the Commonwealth methodology saw detection rates drop, casualty rates fall, and intelligence collection improve. The classified following action reports, not declassified until the 1990s, documented a transformation that some SOG veterans later described as the most significant tactical shy feat of their careers. Learning to be still. Learning that the absence of action was itself a form of dominance. Just a quick moment. Thank you for spending your time with me. If you've enjoyed this story and you'd like more like it, please subscribe to Saber Squad. It genuinely helps the channel, and it keeps these accounts alive. Right, let's carry on. The equipment changes alone were controversial. The US Army had invested enormous sums in the M16 program, and the suggestion that soldiers might benefit from weapons modifications that sacrificed range for a shorter, quieter profile was treated in some quarters as heresy. The institutional resistance ensured the adoption was never universal. Some units embraced the new doctrine completely. Others refused to consider it. The gap between those two groups was measured in mission success rates and in names on casualty lists. The irony is that the techniques Americans struggled to accept in the 1960s became the foundation of modern special operations worldwide. Today, every Tier 1 unit in the Western world, including American formations like Delta Force and DEDGRU, trains in methodologies that trace directly back to those SAS patrols in the Malayan interior. The slow, deliberate movement, the minimal load, the fanatical sound discipline, the patience that looks pathological from the outside until you understand that it is the single factor most likely to determine whether a patrol comes home intact. 22 SAS never sought credit for this transformation. That is not how the regiment operates. There are no press conferences from Hereford, no authorized memoirs trumpeting influence. The regiment's motto, "Who dares wins," is famous. Less famous is what daring actually looks like in practice. Not a headlong charge, but a wounded Scotsman from Fife lying motionless for 2 days with a severed femoral artery, while Indonesian soldiers searched the undergrowth around him, because his training taught him that stillness was the only thing keeping him alive. Those 12 Green Berets who arrived at Kota Tinggi in 1962, expecting a diplomatic holiday, returned home as converts. The staff sergeant who had written home calling the British instructors "old men afraid of tripping" wrote a second letter 6 weeks later. He described watching a 4-man SAS patrol step into primary forest and trying to follow them. "They were 10 meters ahead of me," he wrote. "I could have hit them with a thrown stone. Within 30 seconds, they were gone, not hidden behind something. Gone. The forest closed over them, as if they had never existed. I stood there listening, and I could not hear a single sound that was not the forest itself. That was when I understood. We had been playing at soldiering in the trees. Those men belonged to them." By 1969, Green Berets returning from Vietnam were writing reports that sounded like confessions. Master Sergeant William Hayes who had completed 2 tours with SOG before attending the Australian SAS course at Canungra, submitted an following action report that was circulated at Fort Bragg. "The enemy owns the jungle because they move like they live there," he wrote. "We move like we're visiting. The Commonwealth SAS move like they're hunting. That is the difference. They do not patrol through terrain, they inhabit it. When you watch them disappear into vegetation at arm's length, you understand that everything we thought we knew about field graphite was noise. The shy feet in American doctrine was slow, incremental, and incomplete, but it happened. By the mid-1970s, Special Forces training incorporated sound discipline modules derived directly from British and Australian instruction. Load reduction became doctrine. The emphasis on slow movement through dense terrain replaced the old tempo. Weapons were modified for shorter profiles. Canvas replaced metal wherever acoustics mattered. The men who had laughed in 1962 became the instructors teaching the new doctrine in 1972. One of them, a retired colonel who had been a young captain at Kota Tinggi, spoke at a military history symposium in 1998. He was asked what the most valuable lesson from his career had been. "Learning to shut up," he said, "not with my mouth, with my feet, my equipment, my entire presence. The British taught us that the jungle rewards silence above everything else. Speed gets you killed. Firepower gets you killed. Noise gets you killed. Stillness keeps you alive. It took me 6 weeks to accept that. It took some men their whole careers. Some never accepted it at all. Those are the names on the wall." He was referring to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, panels of black granite carved with 58,000 names. How many of those names belonged to men who moved too fast, carried too much, made too much noise? How many reconnaissance teams were detected because metal plinked against metal in vegetation where silence was survival? The question has no answer. But the men who learned to move like the SAS, who swallowed their pride and accepted that an Allied force with older weapons and lighter loads had cracked a problem American technology could not solve, those men came home at higher rates. The statistics are buried in classified documents, but the veterans know, the ones who adopted the Commonwealth methodology and survived, speak about it in terms that border on religious conversion. "They saved my life," one former SOG operator said in an oral history interview. "Not in a firefight. They saved my life by teaching me that I did not need to be in a firefight in the first place. The best patrol is the one the enemy never knows happened." That was a British idea. We thought it was cowardice. It was wisdom. Dense terrain does not care about budgets or doctrine or national pride. It does not care how many push-ups you can do or how quickly you can clear a room. It rewards one thing only, the willingness to move through it, so slowly and so quietly that you become indistinguishable from the environment itself. The British SAS understood that before anyone else in the Western world. They learned it in Malaya, sharpened it in Borneo, and offered it to anyone willing to listen. The tragedy is how long it took for anyone to accept the offer, and how many men died in the silence between mockery and respect. There is a memorial at the SAS barracks in Hereford, a clock tower that bears the names of every regiment member killed in action since 1950. The names are carved into bronze panels that the weather has turned green. Some of those names belonged to men who died teaching others how to survive. Instructors who spent years passing on field graphite learned at terrible cost in Malayan swamps and Borneo ridgelines, knowing that the students they trained might never know who saved their lives. One name on that memorial is Eddie Geordie Lillico, the sergeant who switched off his rescue beacon and chose to bleed rather than compromise his patrol. He survived Borneo, served 33 years, and died in 2016 in a hospital bed in England, thousands of miles from the jungle that defined his life. In his later years, he gave occasional talks to British and American Special Forces students. He would describe the firefight on the Sikayan River, the severed artery, the morphine, the Indonesian soldiers searching the undergrowth around him, while he lay still for 2 days. The students would always ask the same question. How did you do it? How did you not move? And Liliko would give the same answer every time. Because moving would have killed my mates. So I didn't move. That is the lesson. Not tactics or equipment or technology. The lesson is that silence is a weapon, stillness is a skill, and the willingness to endure discomfort for longer than the enemy believes possible is worth more than all the firepower in the world. The Green Berets who learned that lesson in 1962 brought it home. The ones who learned it in 1968 brought it home in body bags and in minds that would never be quiet again. The ones who accepted it, who swallowed their pride and learned from soldiers who wore sofeet boots and carried old rifles, came home alive. And somewhere in the jungles of Malaya and Borneo and Vietnam, in vegetation so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground, the ghosts of men who moved too loudly are still there, waiting for patrols that will never find them, because the forest does not forgive noise, it only remembers silence.